Imagine if the foundational beliefs that have shaped human societies, sparked wars, and inspired art for millennia were classified not as ultimate truths, but as clinical delusions.
It is a massive concept to grapple with.
It really is. How would that change the way you view the world? You were experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
And today we are immersing ourselves in a monumental and deeply polarizing text.
Yes, Richard Dawkins' massive 2006 bestseller, The God Delusion. Now, right at the top, we need to make something perfectly clear to you. This is a discussion of the book, not original research.
Right.
All content is paraphrased and attributed for educational purposes. Our goal today is strictly to unpack the author's highly controversial arguments, remaining entirely impartial.
That context is incredibly important. It is essential to understand the intellectual and cultural landscape that birthed this specific book analysis. As the author notes in the text, this book arrived in a post-9/11 world.
A very specific era.
Exactly. During that time, religious fundamentalism had become a profound, often volatile flashpoint in global public life. That atmosphere made the questions Dawkins raises feel exceptionally urgent for millions of readers.
The public response was staggering.
It was. The book sold over 3 million copies, was translated into 35 languages, and reached number 2 on the Amazon bestsellers list. It basically became a foundational text for what commentators eventually termed the new atheism movement.
So jumping into the text, the author wastes no time setting boundaries right in the first section. As the book describes, Dawkins draws a very sharp line between two completely different concepts of a higher power.
He wants to define his terms clearly.
He talks about what he calls Einsteinian religion. This is essentially a metaphorical scientific awe of the cosmos.
Right, like when Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking used the word God.
Exactly. They were expressing a profound reverence for the complex mysteries of the physical universe. They were not talking about theology.
Precisely. Dawkins clarifies early on that the book's target is strictly literal theism. He is entirely focused on the belief in a supernatural, interventionist creator.
The kind of deity who listens to individual human prayers.
Yes, a creator who performs literal miracles, reads your thoughts, and actively judges human souls. It is a vital distinction because it frames his entire methodology.
I mean, Dawkins approaches this subject not as an untouchable mystical domain, but as a specific, tangible claim about the nature of reality.
Which is a huge shift in perspective.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the author takes that concept of a supreme being and frames it as a testable scientific proposition. He calls this the God hypothesis.
Instead of treating the concept of a creator as a sacred mystery that exists entirely outside the realm of human logic.
Right. He argues that a universe with a supernatural creator would look fundamentally and scientifically different from a universe without one.
This represents a massive paradigm shift in how this topic is traditionally debated. If the existence of a creator is a scientific hypothesis, then, as Dawkins argues, it must be subjected to the exact same rigorous standards of empirical evidence as any other claim we make about the natural world.
As the book details, Dawkins examines how this hypothesis has evolved over millennia.
He looks at the progression from early tribal polytheism to the monotheism of the Abrahamic faiths. Interestingly, to contextualize secularism, he points directly to the founding of the United States.
Right, he spends a surprising amount of time on the American founding fathers.
He really does. He notes that many of the founding fathers were largely deists, not Orthodox Christians. They envisioned a clockmaker creator,
A force that set the universe in motion with all its physical laws.
but then stepped back and did not intervene in human affairs. Dawkins argues that this specific deist philosophy heavily informed their desire to lay the groundwork for a strictly secular government.
That historical context creates a really smooth runway into how Dawkins takes on some of the most famous theological defenses in history.
He goes right after the classics.
He directly addresses the classical philosophical arguments for God, particularly those formulated by Thomas Aquinas centuries ago. I would love for us to break these down. For instance, he targets the cosmological argument.
Well, the cosmological argument is essentially the argument of the first cause. The logic goes that everything in the physical universe has a cause. Therefore, if you trace that chain of causality all the way back, there must be an original, uncaused first cause that started it all.
And believers label that first cause God.
Yes. But Dawkins challenges the premise itself. As the author argues, invoking God simply creates a paradox. Why does God get an exemption from needing a cause?
If something can exist without a cause, why cannot it just be the universe itself or the Big Bang?
Exactly his point.
And then there's the ontological argument, which always bends my brain a little bit. How does the book dismantle that one?
The ontological argument is purely logical rather than observational. It proposes that God is, by definition, the greatest conceivable being. Since existing in reality is greater than just existing in the mind, a perfect being must exist in reality.
Because otherwise it would not be perfect.
Right. Dawkins spends considerable time dismantling this. He essentially argues that you cannot simply define something into existence through clever wordplay.
He uses parodies, right?
Does. He shows that you could use the exact same logic to prove the existence of a perfectly flawless mythical island.
It is fascinating to see him treat these ancient philosophical pillars like standard scientific theories. He also takes on the teleological argument, which is essentially the argument from design.
The idea that the universe looks designed, so there must be a designer.
But before we get to his massive counter-argument for that, we have to talk about how he approaches the burden of proof.
Yes. This brings us to a crucial philosophical tool Dawkins utilizes. He introduces the analogy of Russell's teapot.
A concept borrowed from the early 20th century philosopher Bertrand Russell.
The analogy asks you to imagine someone claiming that there is a microscopic china teapot currently orbiting the sun, somewhere in space between Earth and Mars.
Because this teapot is far too small to be seen by our most powerful telescopes, no one can definitively disprove its existence.
But just because we cannot technically disprove the existence of a microscopic space teapot does not mean we should treat its existence as a serious 50-50 possibility.
Let alone build an entire global society around it.
As the book details, this analogy argues that the burden of proof lies entirely with the person making an extraordinary, untestable claim, not with the skeptic.
Exactly. It is a powerful illustration of why Dawkins believes default skepticism is the only logical starting position when faced with any supernatural claim.
You do not start by believing in the teapot and demanding evidence to disprove it. You start by lacking belief until evidence is provided.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because all of that groundwork sets up what many consider the absolute intellectual core of the book.
Dawkins presents his signature argument.
Yes, the ultimate Boeing 747 gambit. Where does that metaphor even come from?
The Boeing 747 metaphor was originally coined by an astronomer named Fred Hoyle. Hoyle was actually using it to support creationism.
Oh, interesting.
He argued that the probability of complex life originating on Earth purely by chance is roughly equivalent to a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and accidentally assembling a fully functional, ready-to-fly Boeing 747.
In other words, biological life is just too incredibly complex to exist without a conscious designer putting the pieces together.
It is an analogy that appeals strongly to basic human intuition. When we see a complex machine, we naturally assume a mechanic built it.
But as the author explains, Dawkins completely flips this argument on its head.
He does. Dawkins argues that if you invoke a highly complex, omniscient God to explain the immense complexity of the biological universe, you absolutely do not solve the problem.
You simply create a much larger, more impossible problem.
Because then you have to ask, who designed the designer?
If the universe is a complex 747 that requires a builder, then a deity capable of designing that entire universe, listening to billions of individual thoughts simultaneously, and managing the macro physics of galaxies must be an ultimate Boeing 747.
It is an infinitely more complex entity.
Precisely. Dawkins insists that postulating a complex designer to explain complexity is an intellectual dead end. The narrative progresses as Dawkins presents Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection as the ultimate scientifically proven alternative.
Natural selection elegantly explains how astonishing biological complexity arises from incredibly simple beginnings, entirely without the need for a top-down designer.
It is a bottom-up process, minute, gradual changes over millions of years accumulating into complex life. So, does Dawkins claim absolute 100% certainty that no higher power exists?
No, and that is a critical nuance. Dawkins asserts that natural selection makes the God hypothesis statistically deeply improbable, but not strictly impossible to disprove entirely.
Much like the orbiting teapot.
Exactly. To quantify this, the book introduces a 7-point spectrum of theistic probability. Number 1 represents absolute certainty that God exists. Number 7 represents absolute certainty that God does not exist.
And where does Dawkins place himself on that scale?
He places himself at a 6 out of 7. He explicitly states he is not a 7.
Meaning he leans very strongly toward atheism, living his life on the practical assumption that there is no God.
But he acknowledges that absolute scientific certainty regarding a negative is impossible.
If you are enjoying this deep exploration, remember to check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, inspiring reflection, and rational thought.
It is a great resource.
So if we accept Dawkins' premise that there is no top-down designer, that leaves a massive elephant in the room. If God almost certainly does not exist, why is religious belief so incredibly universal?
Every human culture across the globe has developed some form of religion.
What's fascinating here is that Dawkins turns away from physics and biology and looks directly at evolutionary psychology.
If religion is not a truth handed down from the divine, it must be a Darwinian byproduct.
As the book describes, human cognitive processes evolved specifically for survival in harsh prehistoric environments.
And sometimes those vital adaptations have unintended side effects.
The book uses a highly relatable psychological example that makes perfect sense. Human children have developed a vital adaptive survival trait to uncritically trust authority figures.
If an early human parent warns a child not to touch a burning fire or swim in a river full of predators, the child who instantly, unquestioningly believes the warning survives to pass on their genes.
The child who demands empirical evidence gets eaten.
That is the evolutionary benefit. But, as the author explains, that exact same uncritical trust makes young minds perfectly primed to inherit complex religious beliefs from their elders.
The brain's survival mechanism accidentally functions as an incredibly absorbent sponge for cultural tradition.
The child's brain does not distinguish between practical advice about fire and complex theological doctrine about the afterlife.
That helps explain why children generally adopt the religion of their parents. But Dawkins takes it a step further to explain how these ideas spread across entire populations.
And this is where he brings in a concept that has completely taken over modern language: the meme.
Yes, Richard Dawkins actually coined the term meme decades earlier in his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene.
Most people today associate the word with viral internet jokes, but Dawkins meant it in a strictly scientific anthropological sense.
While genes are units of biological transmission, a meme is a unit of cultural transmission.
So ideas, catchy musical tunes, fashion trends, and religious concepts act like cultural viruses.
Exactly. Memes replicate across generations, jumping from brain to brain. And just like biological organisms, memes adapt to their environments to ensure their continued survival within the human population.
Dawkins argues that religious concepts like the promise of eternal reward or the threat of eternal punishment are incredibly successful memes because they are psychologically compelling.
They are perfectly designed to stick in the human mind and demand to be shared.
It is a completely different, almost mechanical lens through which to view human culture. But this leads us to ask another massive question. Where does our sense of right and wrong come from?
Right, if there is no divine lawgiver handing down commandments, why are humans moral? Dawkins directly challenges the pervasive claim that morality requires religion.
According to the book, Dawkins argues that human moral instincts are fundamentally driven by evolutionary altruism and social cooperation.
We evolved as social primates living in tribes on the African savanna.
Working together, feeling empathy for tribe members, and protecting one another were traits that actively helped early humans survive.
A tribe that cooperated outcompeted a tribe that constantly murdered each other. Therefore, empathy and reciprocal altruism were genetically selected for.
He presents data suggesting that moral intuitions are broadly consistent across both religious and non-religious populations globally.
Atheists and believers generally agree on basic moral principles, which implies a natural shared origin for ethics.
However, a major escalation in the text occurs when Dawkins turns his analytical lens onto religious texts themselves.
We must emphasize again to you that we are objectively reporting Dawkins' highly controversial moral indictment of these texts, maintaining strict impartiality.
It is a highly charged section. As Dawkins describes it, a close reading of the Old Testament reveals historical episodes of extreme violence, conquest, and societal rules that modern readers universally find appalling.
He points out instances where the text condones behaviors that modern secular law classifies as human rights violations.
He also looks at the New Testament and points out that modern believers routinely and thankfully ignore or reinterpret many biblical commands.
Dawkins asks a pointed question. If modern believers are picking and choosing which parts of the scripture to follow based on modern ethics, where is that modern ethical standard actually coming from?
It clearly is not coming directly from a literal reading of the ancient text.
His answer to that question is the moral zeitgeist.
Dawkins defines the moral zeitgeist as an observable historical trend, showing that human society's moral standards improve gradually over time.
Over centuries, humanity becomes more inclusive, less violent, and more empathetic.
And Dawkins argues that this progression happens completely independently of religion. Society's collective conscience evolves, like realizing slavery is an atrocity, or recognizing women's rights and religious interpretations eventually shift to catch up with that secular progress.
The narrative progresses into a section where the author actually addresses his own critics. Many readers and prominent literary figures felt Dawkins was simply too aggressive.
The literary critic Terry Eagleton famously accused Dawkins of fighting a straw man and refusing to engage with sophisticated, nuanced theology.
But as the book notes, Dawkins aggressively defends his uncompromising hostile tone.
He does not apologize for it at all. Dawkins defends his hostility by pointing directly to the real-world harms caused by religious absolutism.
He argues that this is not just a polite philosophical debate. He catalogs issues like religious fundamentalism's active conflict with science education in public schools.
He points to institutionalized hostility toward gay people and the suppression of medical research.
Dawkins argues that when beliefs demand absolute deference and cannot be questioned or mocked, they become inherently dangerous.
He believes that polite disengagement is an irresponsible option when faced with tangible societal harms.
And this unapologetic stance sets the stage for the most hotly debated section of the entire text, his views on childhood indoctrination.
This specific chapter generated immense, widespread public controversy.
As the author argues, labeling a very young child with a specific religious identity, like calling a toddler a Catholic child or a Muslim child before they possess the cognitive ability to evaluate evidence, is a profound psychological imposition.
He makes the point that we would never call a 4-year-old a Keynesian economics child or an existentialist child because we recognize they cannot comprehend those concepts.
He likens imposing religious labels to a form of psychological conditioning that dramatically impacts a person's capacity for free thought later in life.
The book describes how children raised in strict religious environments often carry the heavy psychological weight of immense guilt, an intense fear of divine punishment, and a deeply suppressed sense of doubt well into adulthood.
Dawkins argues passionately for children's rights to an open mind, to be taught how to think, not what to think.
We absolutely must note, maintaining strict neutrality, that this specific argument drew incredibly passionate pushback.
Civil liberties advocates, religious communities, and even secular commentators argued vehemently against his characterization.
Many felt equating religious upbringing to psychological harm was profoundly offensive and legally dangerous, making it one of the most polarizing arguments of the decade.
The pushback was intense. Events develop when Dawkins challenges the final, perhaps most human defense of faith as the book draws toward its conclusion.
Even if a reader fully accepts all his scientific arguments against the existence of God, there remains a lingering, deeply emotional question.
Does religion fill a necessary psychological gap? Humans naturally seek a sense of wonder, a feeling of community, and profound comfort, especially when faced with the terrifying reality of our own mortality.
It is a totally valid question. Does tearing down religion just leave people feeling empty and terrified?
Dawkins completely acknowledges these deeply human needs. However, as the author explains, he firmly rejects the idea that supernatural belief is the only way, or even the best way, to fulfill them.
The final narrative progression of the book makes an incredibly positive, almost poetic case for the secular life.
He argues that the human need for wonder is richly and beautifully met through the study of science and the incredible realities of the natural world.
Understanding the immense scale of the cosmos or the intricate complexity of biological evolution provides far more genuine awe than ancient myths.
He argues that community and comfort can be found in human relationships, in art, in music, and in philosophy.
For Dawkins, understanding the brief, astonishing improbability of our conscious existence is not a source of despair or nihilism. It is a source of profound gratitude and deep meaning.
It is a perspective that asks you to find the truly miraculous in the ordinary facts of biology and astronomy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an important question to leave you with, to mull over on your own.
If Dawkins is right about the moral zeitgeist, that human morality evolves independently over time, What deeply held moral certainties of our current era will future generations look back on and evolve completely beyond?
It is a question that challenges all of us to critically examine our current values.
Whether you found this summary useful for your reviews at Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via the link, and always think critically. See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.